Housing prices suck, interest rates suck, housing affordability overall sucks, but there's this belief that a change in politics, a change in the presidency might correct everything that is currently wrong with the housing market. Josh, politics are polarizing. We often get people on our videos commenting saying, hey, just wait until this happens or wait until this happens, whatever it is. So I want to spend some time today and actually talk about what the presidency controls, what's likely to happen if we currently see, the same person in office and or a change in that presidency. What does that mean for housing? Let's do that to help our listeners become educated homebuyers.
Absolutely. To a large degree, Jeb, why? Why do people look at this? Because it's a known. We know that November 5th, we're going to have an election. We know that January 1 of next year, we're either going to have certainty of 4 more years of Joe Biden, or we're going to have the uncertainty, craziness of 4 more years of Trump. So this year is an interesting one in that the majority of US voters are not happy with either of those options, but we're going to get one. So it's that certainty of a new tomorrow, a change, something different coming. And this belief, and we're going to kind of go through some of these beliefs, that a change in presidency does this, an election year causes this. So it's not even so much about the people, because if you go back, we were doing our research for the show, and you Google things and you see these same articles written every 4 years. So it's not about the two guys that are running for president this year. It's the fact that we have an election. And some of those articles say about the president, is it an incumbent issue? Is it a change in parties issue? But the most relevant data really just talks about the economy. And I'll go back and I always say that presidents get far too much credit when things are going good
Mhm.
and far too much blame when things are going bad. And for a lot of people, it's just, what do we talk about with all the economic data that we're looking at right now, Jeb? You get this data and half the people look at it going, yeah, that's shitty data. That sucks. And then the other half are going, oh, it's great. It's wonderful. And people are looking at it the same way. What's good, what's bad, what's likely to change. So we're going to go through some of the facts, some of the myths around election years and changes in presidents or incumbents retaining the office, and see if there's anything that we can tell you about the housing market and interest rates going forward to help you make better decisions as an educated homebuyer. Before we start, we want to put a trigger warning on this. A trigger warning in the sense that any discussion of politics brings out the worst in people and makes people assume, think, believe bad things about the people presenting the information. We try our best to be completely apolitical. The only reason for today's episode is we're getting a lot of questions in terms of how does the election year impact housing and interest rates, and how does who wins the election dictate what is going to happen going forward. So we're doing our best to answer those questions. Nothing contained in this episode is an endorsement of any candidate or political party, and hopefully no indication of where our beliefs lie, because you shouldn't be taking your political opinions from two guys talking about housing.
At the end of the day, people just want to know, you know, is buying now a mistake? Should I buy now? Are things going to be better in the future? And, that's essentially why we're talking about this, because there's this belief that something has to change, that things have been essentially out of whack for too long, in one degree or another. And that, by a change in whoever's in office, that things will get better or potentially worse, depending on which side you're on, with that change in politics. So I think it's important, Josh, to really kind of start the conversation by talking, what does the president actually control when it comes to mortgage rates? Like, who controls mortgage rates? What are mortgage rates based on? Because I think there's this idea that mortgage rates are based off, some guy sitting in an office deciding which direction the market's going to go. And in all reality, that's not the case at all.
Well, hey, we could do probably a whole 2-3 hour episode on this.
So let's not.
Let's not. But in reality, what is interest? Interest is the cost of capital. Some people have money, they have excess funds, and they will loan it to other people, but they don't do it out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it to get a return on that capital. And that's what interest is. So we talk about nominal interest rates. That's, if today's mortgage rate, Mortgage News Daily says it's 7.14, that's the nominal interest rate. But what is the real interest rate? The person that loaned that money, what do they really get after inflation? Because that's the concern. You as a consumer look at this and go, inflation means I have to pay more for gas, for groceries, for rent, all of those things. As an investor, someone with capital and loaning that money out, you're saying that is the reducer on my return. So great. Someone loaning money out at 8% right now could be going, hey, that's a great rate of return I'm getting on my money. But if you flash back to 1982 and rates are at 16%, you're like, whoo, I'm losing money because inflation is more than what my actual rate of return is. So that is what interest is. So the question behind that is, how much does the president control that? They control, or they don't control almost anything, Jeb. They set the agenda for
Mhm,
policy wise what we're going to do in terms of spending.
mhm.
They impact the Federal Reserve, which is non political, separate from the government, by putting people on the Federal Reserve Board, nominating them for terms, and they get confirmed, and they're not up for election. We as voters don't get to say about that. So over time, much like the Supreme Court, also not political, but when you have openings that are largely filled by one president or the other, there can be an ideological bent to it. But for the most part, the Fed has remained apolitical. They do what they think is best over the long haul. So the Fed sets monetary policy. The president is supposed to set a budget. And this is not a slam on Biden. This one here is not a slam on Biden because Trump did the same thing. We're going back like almost 12 years that at the beginning of the year, the president is supposed to present a budget to Congress to approve. And none of them have done it for like 10 years. They eventually do it, but they don't do it on their deadline of when they're supposed to. And really that's part of our problem, and we will get into that. So in terms of what controls interest rates, the Federal Reserve is setting short-term policy rates with the idea of adding stimulus or putting a brake on the economy to keep it where we have full employment and stable prices, which is defined as PCE, core PCE at 2%. So when we look at those two things, what can the president do? They can set policy going forward that will dictate spending, and that will dictate what our budget and, or more importantly, the deficit looks like and what we have to finance going forward.
No, I think it's important to know that. And now you mentioned something in there that the Fed isn't really, one-sided, if you will, when it comes to this, and that they're elected, or not elected, appointed by whoever's in office at that time. But we can go back to 2018 and 2019 when President Trump at the time wanted the Fed to essentially lower the Fed funds rate. And at that time, chair said no, they weren't willing to do that, right? They kept monetary policy essentially where it was. Now we come flash forward essentially 6 years, 5, 6 years from now. Again, we have an issue with the Fed funds rate. And, Biden probably would like to see the Fed funds rate lower because it makes him, again, look better, in office, will help him get reelected in a year if things are moving in the right direction for him. And guess what? The Fed's not budging, literally. And so the Fed isn't, I think people just think, hey, whoever's in office, the Fed's going to roll over and do whatever they want. And it's a false belief. And it's something that we need to address because I think people want to believe, people want change, right? That's the easy thing to see. People just want to see change. And the easy answer, the easy button, if you will, is, hey, somebody coming in is going to be that change, when in all reality, it's probably to have less of an impact than most people think. Because what's going to happen this year is you're going to get a lot of overpromising from both sides. You're going to get people that want to do different things, whether it's, control the budget, whether it's spend money, give money away, give student loans away for everybody in the world forever and never have to pay anything back. Whatever it is, there's this idea and people jump onto that idea. And then what happens is they get reelected and things change. And not because their beliefs change, just because it's harder to get through the House and Congress. And, you can overpromise all day long, but at the end of the day, the president doesn't have as much control as we as citizens would actually like to believe to some degree.
Well, we're focused on, you're 100% correct that people want change, especially people who are looking to buy homes, not necessarily homeowners. Homeowners may want to move and they want lower interest rates so the payment is lower on their new home, or that they can reasonably give up a 3% interest rate for a 5% interest rate versus today's 6.5, 7%. But what is the change people want? Big picture, it's more affordable home ownership and housing. So even renters. So what does that mean? We've already hinted here at interest rates. What are interest rates? How much control does a president have on that? How much control does the Fed have on that? But we also want to talk about lower prices. So think about this: 60 something percent of American households are homeowners. Do they want lower prices? No one wants a lower price of an asset that they own. So if you could enact some public policy at the federal level that would lower home prices, you just upset 2/3 of the populace. So that's unlikely to happen as a policy measure. So what could put the brake on future increases, make housing more affordable, would be an increase in supply. So if we look at policy wise, what could the federal government do to increase supply? That's really the area where they're most likely to impact, because all of the other decisions they've made have impacted inflation. Inflation will determine where interest rates settle, not who's in the office of president. Home prices are going to be a function of supply and demand, which a sort of an accelerant or a brake on that is interest rates and the affordability of the payment. The reason why we talked a lot during the pandemic that home prices were shooting up precipitously, but payments were not. You know, they were at a much lower level. We didn't have a huge spike in payments, even though prices were going up, because rates had gone from, you know, 2018, we hit low fives. We went to the start of the pandemic, were low fours, high threes. But when you drop a percent in interest rate, you can absorb a 20% increase in home prices, and people don't squawk all that much because all they think about is their monthly payment. Now we're on the flip side of that. We had 3 years of really high home price increases. And then at the end of that, we doubled interest rates. That's where it became a problem. So affordability could be solved by more supply much more easily than any of the other policy levers that might be determined by the outcome of the election.
Now, you said something a minute ago, Josh, that I don't necessarily agree with. You said interest rates are going to settle where they settle, regardless of who's in office. But who's in office depends on how much spending is done in different areas. If there's stimulus, if there's different things that could impact inflation, could impact the budget, right? We've been talking about our budget now, the deficit rather, being at what, 34 trillion and climbing. At some point, we're getting to the point where the government can't even pay their own interest on the debt, right? I mean, it's the interest is higher than the defense budget. It's getting close to Social Security and some other things within the next 5 years. So it is a problem. So, we say it doesn't matter who's in office, but to some degree it does matter. I mean, that's a whole different conversation. They're probably a rabbit hole we don't go down.
No, let's go down that right here for right now, because you're saying there's a distinction over who wins the office, and I'm telling you there's not. We had 8 years of Bush. We had 8 years of Obama. We had 4 years of Trump. We had 4 years of Biden. Go look at the trajectory of the debt. It may have
gone up, right? No, for sure.
Through all of them. So the problem is we have a system that you talked about earlier, over promising, where you get reelected by promising everyone you're going to spend for them. And we kick the can further down the road. And we are starting to get the younger generation, the 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds going, hey, that's cool that you guys have kept the status quo by just adding to the debt and kicking it down the line. But I have news for anyone who thinks that Trump is magic and going to fix things, or that Biden being in office for another 4 years is magic or going to fix things. They both will spend money, and they have a track record of having spent 4 years in the office of having done that. So interest rates will settle where they're going to settle, because until they are forced not to, the government is going to continue spending money. And if you look trajectory wise, the only thing that tells us that interest rates and inflation would be higher going forward would be the spending of our federal government. And how do we find more and more people to buy more and more bonds to finance that debt? That's the big picture, long haul, that will impact interest rates. But there's no distinction. There is no difference between the parties. They are identical in that regard.
No, you're right. No, I mean, no, they're both going to keep spending, and deficit's going to continue to grow. But Josh, people here don't care about that. They do probably care about it, but they're more interested in, what's going to impact them. So you mentioned earlier, supply could change. So what could the government do in theory? Like right now, say you live in California, to break ground on a home here in the state of California. At one point, a couple of years back, it was like $100,000 just to break ground. You've got policy over things like, what they have to do to the soil and just crazy things here in California before you can ever start to build. The government can do whatever they want, but states like California and some of these other states have policy on top of whatever is a nationwide policy that keeps things like supply from being built, right? I mean, Texas, they're building homes like crazy. California, yeah, land is a problem in a lot of the areas that we're in, but there's a lot of areas where building could happen. It just doesn't make sense financially because of what the cost is. So, we can say, hey, the president's going to change one, the building aspect, or make it more lenient. They could give builders some incentives to build and that sort of thing. But then, how does states affect that piece, right? Because there's always kind of an overlay, if you will, on some of this stuff that keeps it from um, being able to impact everyone and improve, housing affordability, if you will, nationwide.
So we are most familiar with California land use policy. Very blue state, very blue policy. And I'll touch a little bit on Montana and how they've approached this, because very, very different than California, but they're doing some of the same things. And I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. So going back to the 40s and 50s, cities throughout the state of California and the state of California set land use restrictions. And the thing was, they didn't want to create ultra dense housing that couldn't be supported, wasn't supported by enough schools, enough roads, all of that stuff. There are problems that come with density. So now, because we can look back and say, probably it was a little overly restrictive, but not a ton, a little overly restrictive. Now they go, well, if it was a little overly restrictive and that led to some of the problems, let's do away with all the restrictions. You want to put a 2-bedroom ADU in your backyard? Cool. We don't care if there's any parking. We don't care if there's no street parking, no room for extra houses. We don't care if we have anything for that. And that part is crazy. We've talked about this on the show before. Our neighborhoods here in Huntington Beach are primarily 6,000 square foot lot tract homes. They don't support additional 1,000 square foot properties on there. So from that perspective, the government is enacting policies saying you need to make affordable housing, and affordable housing isn't generally for purchase. It's affordable rental housing. So we've seen here in Huntington Beach has fought back hard against this, because we have an area of $3 to $5 million homes that a large parcel has come available, and the zoning in there was equestrian. It's equestrian property. And forget that. I mean, if you bought and it's surrounded on all sides by equestrian properties,
I'm not arguing it. I'm just saying.
In what world do you go, you know what, you need more affordable housing. We're going to put luxury, or we're going to put not even luxury. We're going to put 3-4 story apartments in there, overwhelm the schools, overwhelm the fire department, and all of that. And it's funny. The thing that I've always said is, the thing that's weird is I never see the state of California going after Beverly Hills or Corona Del Mar. They are now in a lawsuit with Beverly Hills. The Beverly Hills is not creating enough affordable housing. You hear that and you want to chuckle, because you go, that's insane. People who don't have a lot of money can't live in Beverly Hills. So it's sort of like saying, hey, we have an obesity epidemic in the United States. We're going to repeal the law of gravity, and now no one's too heavy. Everyone's just fine. That is the state's response to it. So there is a problem. A response is appropriate. Some loosening of that land use policy is appropriate, but just saying, hey, you need to add 10,000 units in a city that's pretty much already built out doesn't make any sense. Now, the reason why I wanted to mention Montana, not a blue state. They're a little purple, kind of like Orange County, where it was a traditionally red state and getting more liberal, but they've sort of come to this hybrid, because what happened in Montana, a wide open state, and they're saying,
I've seen Yellowstone, bro. I know what happened.
They're saying, well, you can't build there. You can't build there. You can't build there. And it's like, well, why? Our population grew. We have the land, and they have loosened things up in terms of what they're building. Spokane, Washington, another blue state. It's where I went to school. And what they're doing is areas where previously could only be a single family home is now you can build a duplex on there. Now that makes sense, but again, within some constraints. On a 6,000 square foot lot, does a duplex make sense? Maybe, maybe not. But a lot of these are 8,000 square foot lots. We can do that. And Ed Pinto, who we talk a lot about at the American Enterprise Institute, he did a big op-ed saying, why do we allow someone to tear down a house in that neighborhood and build a 5,000 square foot house in a neighborhood of 1,500 square foot homes, but we won't allow them to build a triplex of 3 1,500 square foot homes? So there's a balance. There is a right answer here, because the reality is, again, for us here in Huntington Beach, the question should be, do we have enough workforce housing? Not do we have enough affordable housing. Because if you can't afford to live in Huntington Beach, right near the ocean, you just can't afford to live here. But the residents, Jeb, Josh, you can't say, well, school teachers, firemen, police, they need to commute in from 2 hours away to provide the services we need. There are questions here that are valid. And this is why we talk about, you know, I believe in limited government, but there is a role for government, because absent that, if it's pure open free market, we're going to say, what's the highest and best use? And every expensive coastal area in the United States will be super high price. So just raise more questions than answers. So what I would say from a policy perspective and the federal level, some markets, fewer than most people think, but some markets in the US have been impacted by institutional buying or build to rent. You can put some limitations on that. I don't know that that's a huge impact or a huge change. As you said, you can give some incentives to builders, but not just to build the most appropriate homes.
Yeah.
We don't have a lack of McMansions in the US. We have a lack of 1,500 square foot, 3-bedroom, 2-bath starter homes. So there are some things that could be done. And to my knowledge, neither candidate for president is talking about those things.
Well, yeah. And I mean, and I think that's what most people are interested in. They're interested in how it impacts them. You often hear me say, like, you got to control what you can control. And one of the things you can't control is what the government does. Like, you can't get wrapped up in the idea that somebody is going to fix the problem. The problem is way bigger than any of us even realize, I think, to some degree. And even if change was enacted, policies were signed, that stuff doesn't happen immediately. It takes time, years for that to happen. And that's what you really need to think about. I mean, Josh, I think one thing that's going to could impact, the election, things going forward, who ends up in office, is the idea of a recession. We want to touch on briefly, what's happening right now and how that might impact. I mean, we don't really want to get into the politics side of who gets into office, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. I don't think it's going to change the overall landscape, which is, I think, what most people need to understand. Biden gets reelected, Trump gets reelected, house prices aren't going to become any more affordable, at least in the short term, right? I mean, there would have to be changes in things that we've talked about here for that to happen, and none of it's immediate. But Josh, recession, what comes to mind when we talk about recession?
So going back to the 1950s, when we had the two-term limit impacted, we have had 4 elections during a recession, and every time the incumbent lost. So pretty obvious that if your household's not doing well, you're in a recession, the economy is not doing well, people just want change. They don't know what the change is, but they're going to make change. So the question then becomes, are we in a recession, or are we likely to see one before the election? And the answers are pretty resounding no. No, just today, we got the Q4 second look. The third will be the final, but the second look, it was revised down, I believe, to 3.2%. That's solid growth. That's well above the trend over the last 10, 15 years. So the average length of time from when the recession sets in to when the government calls it a recession is 234 days. So if on January 1, the economy had just magically turned over into recession, it's 309 days till the election. That didn't happen. It would be Q2 or Q3 before we see it. And it's going to be next year before it ever gets called. So we can debate it. We're getting mixed signals. I could give you 20 signals that say we're in a recession or headed towards it soon. And I can give you 20 that say that's insane. We got 3.2% GDP last quarter. You're out of your mind. Why are you talking about it? So is a recession going to be at all predictive of what happens? Highly unlikely. The second piece of that is, what can we look at? The other things that are measured that can tell us that people are unhappy with the incumbent and might be likely to go one way or the other is consumer sentiment and consumer confidence. Both were relatively weak over the last year, despite GDP being good, because what do people look at? We hear this all the time on the show. Hey, why do you guys keep talking about inflation is moderating and getting under control? Inflation sucks. And what they mean by that is, if you look at the total of inflation over the last 3 years, prices are up 15 to 20%. And that's a burden. That's a burden on households. So they're feeling that. So as long as that sentiment remains low, it bodes poorly for Biden and better for Trump. And in the early going, we are still way early in this process, but the polls show Trump ahead of Biden if it comes down to the two of them. But we just said consumer sentiment, consumer confidence is improving. If that improves right through the recession, could easily turn around. So nothing there is really predictive for us either. But the most important part is the two of us looking at it going, I don't think it matters for housing or interest rates in the next 1, 2, 3 years.
No, again, people want to, when we talked to, I mentioned earlier, people comment on the videos, and they have some sort of response that this is going to change. When this person gets elected, it's going to change. But there's never any follow up. There's never any. This is how it's going to impact. And the reality is, again, these guys that are in office have very little control. We want to put all of our problems on the president. And then, when things are going awful, and then when things are perfect, we give them too much credit to some degree. And a lot of times what they're experiencing is something that was enacted 3-4 years before they're ever in office. So they're just getting the return for something that happened in the past. And it can go both ways on that. So I think if you're a home buyer out there and you're looking to, create that foundation, you're looking to start a family, you got financial security, job security, money in the bank, all of the things that we've talked about, I don't think there's any reason why you would say, I'm going to wait to see what happens, with the election before making a decision. I think it's all a personal decision. If that's your thing, if you're really into politics and you watch whatever your news station is every day and you're just waiting for a change in one direction or another, so be it. I just don't think that that's the solution. Again, control the controllables. Josh.
Well, the one thing, control the controllables in terms of all of that economic stuff, what happens in election years. The one that we didn't talk about that actually will come into play here is there is a myth that the Federal Reserve, being apolitical, will stay out of the way during an election year. And we've seen that since the 1950s, 2012 was the only election year when there was no Fed policy change, either an increase or a decrease to interest rates. So the Fed is likely to do what they're going to do. The election is November 5th. I didn't look at the meetings. We have a meeting in October just before that. Highly likely that they stay the hell out of the way the month before the election. But right now, they are still calling for 3 cuts, second half of the year. The futures market is saying starting in June. So June, July, September, somewhere along those lines. I think it tells us that everything is lining up and on track. Don't expect the Fed to stay out of the way. It's all status quo. Nothing is going to change. I mean, those two candidates have more in common than their supporters would ever like to admit. In addition to being really old white males, there's just so much more there. While being polar opposites to one level, there's a lot of similarities in terms of what they do spending wise that will keep things moving in the same direction for housing in the near term.
And so if you're listening to this, the easy answer is don't get caught up in the headlines. Don't get caught up in the idea that somebody's going to solve your problems. Don't go down the rabbit hole there. Instead, continue to do what you're doing, which if you're listening to this, you're educating yourself, which is the right answer. And, again, I will say it for probably the 5th time here, control what you can control. You can control down payment. You can control your credit scores. You can control where you are in the process, being ready, not being ready, whatever it is, so that when an opportunity presents itself, you're in the best position possible. So, Josh, what's your way to send us out today?
We live in a magical age of data. So just like you can jump on your phone, on your computer and listen to us, you can research, you can vet everything we talked about today. It is all out there. So consider the source, but educate yourself, consider the source, see what their biases are. Everyone is biased. Biased to get this horrible, terrible name out there, but we're all biased. We're biased in favor of strong people. We're biased in favor of Californians against Californians. We all have these acknowledged or unacknowledged biases. So when you're trying to make the best decisions for you and your family, do your research, try and set your biases aside, try and determine what the biases are of the people that are providing your information. But you're doing the right thing. Do the research, make the best decisions for you and your family.
Until then, buy right, borrow smart, build wealth. Adios.
Amigos.